You guys just you keep coming around. I just keep hearing about you guys.
And I might need to tell Ryan to cut that up a little bit and just put it in my audio for my phone.
First of all, I love the game. I had a passion to play the game, not only football, but I love the game of golf. And what it lends to a person and the friendships you develop on the golf course.
It's been a pleasure being on the drop. I wish you guys all the best down the road.
As someone like you have that golf itch like a lot of us do.
I keep track of you, and you are moving. You are on the move.
So listen, I'm a big New Jersey golf guy. You're very kind, Mike, and you too, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be on just a couple of Jersey boys here talking about something we love. All the best. I really enjoyed it.
This is the Drop Podcast where we talk golfing. In the Garden State, I'm Mike Poro, and this is Ryan Coulott.
What's up, Drop Pod people? Welcome back to Interview Thursday, where we are very excited about today's guest, who is Brian Schneider, golf course redesigner, renovator. Mike, I believe the name of his company is Renaissance Golf. He's the guy, Renaissance Golf Design. He's a golf course architect who has done many things. He's done the redesign at North Jersey, which we've talked about the things that they've done there. He's redesigned Hollywood, and we've talked about the things he does there. And I don't even know, and he was very particular, Mike, so I should know better. But he gave us the definition between a redesign and a renovation, and kind of what his goal is and how he does it. And those that know me know I love history, and that the way that he goes about the process of like his redo of Hollywood, going into the vaults, checking out all of their, go into the historians, seeing aerial pictures, seeing pictures of tournaments, and kind of bringing the course back to the way that it was originally designed, I think is a very, the history nerd in me gets my spidey senses tingling. So I love what he does there. I think it's a great interview. It's, interesting to hear, kind of his process and what he does, and anybody that's kind of in the golf course architecture world would be interested in hearing what he has to say.
Yeah, listen, as we were students with this interview, we were taught by the teacher. We've had different people on that's kind of educated us about different things. Scott Fawcett about how to play better golf. Stephen Kay's been on before, talk about golf course architecture. And now, one of the up and coming, if not one of the hottest names out there, Brian Schneider, kind of educates us on a lot of things: restoration, renovation, changes, what he likes, what he doesn't like. And the fact that we're doing North Jersey all week, what better person to have on than the guy that's kind of put his fingerprints on that spot than Brian Schneider. So
for sure. Yeah.
Exciting.
Very exciting. So without further ado, we're going to send you right to that interview. Here's our chat with Brian Schneider. Enjoy.
This episode is brought to you by Gimme Cocktails. Golf season is back, and so is your go-to drink for the golf course. Gimme Cocktails is a golf-inspired canned cocktail made with premium vodka, real juice, and a splash of fizz. Choose from lemonade iced tea or pineapple, and stay tuned. A brand new flavor is dropping soon. Crisp, refreshing, and it packs a 7% punch. You can find Gimme Cocktails at Total Wine, Circus Liquors, Huddy's and Colts Neck, and select golf courses across New Jersey. It's a Jersey-based company, so drink local. The perfect drink to tee up your round or toast to a great one after. Follow at gimme_cocktails on Instagram or visit gimmecocktails.com. Gimme Cocktails. Pick it up. All right, so today we're joined by renowned golf course architect Brian Schneider, whose work includes restoring some of New Jersey's most historic golf clubs. Brian, thank you so much for coming on today's show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, Brian, this is going to be a real treat for us. We don't do a whole lot of like the golf course architect, designer, redesigner, whatever title you want to give yourself. But this is going to be a cool treat for us, not just someone of your caliber, but also someone that does what you do. We don't tend to have a lot of you guys on.
Should be fun. I love talking golf and golf in New Jersey.
So kind of let's get started here, because I think when we've had conversations with a lot of different people here on the podcast. It's about, the playing side of things. And it's all about how do they become better with their games, maybe with their business side of the operation. But how did you get into the field that you're in? What led you to, becoming an architect, designing golf course, restoring golf courses? What led you down that path?
I definitely can't help you with those other things. But I've played golf all my life, since I was very young. And, there came a point where I realized that traveling around and seeing different golf courses is something I really enjoyed. And one of the things I loved about the game. And it's still something I love about the game. Golf is really unique in that, I don't know how many pastimes, I guess if you're a hiker or maybe a cyclist or something, you want to travel the world and do those things in different places. But golf takes you so many places that you would never think to go if it weren't for the great golf course that you want to play. So the travel and seeking out new courses is something I enjoyed since I was pretty young. And then at some point, I had a realization that there were actually people who designed those golf courses, that they didn't just come to be naturally, that's a way to make a living. So I decided that was something I wanted to pursue pretty late in my college career. I'd studied biochemistry and molecular biology, thinking I wanted to be a doctor, and punted on that pretty late, decided to get into golf instead, and specifically pursue work in course design and course construction. So I spent the better part of 5 years post-college. I went to school at the University of Wisconsin, and even before finishing school, started working on the maintenance crew at Black Wolf Run while they were building the first golf course at Whistling Straits in Fuller, which is just an hour and a half from Madison, where I went to school. So I was hanging out over there a bit before graduation and spent the summer there. Really liked that, got to see the construction process at Whistling Straits, and was pretty hooked and knew that this was what I wanted to do for a living. So I spent the next 3 or 4 years bouncing around the country, spent some time in the UK, just playing golf while mowing greens and raking bunkers, and studied as many courses as I could. That's kind of how I taught myself architecture and prepared myself to do what I do now.
How is the game? Do you get to play a lot these days, or you get to, did you grow up playing? What's the history of your game going back there?
Yeah, I've played since I was very young, and I love to play. I still love to play. Honestly, I like hitting golf shots more than I enjoy keeping score. So I really haven't kept score in, 10, 15 years. And usually when I'm playing with buddies that I play with frequently, and we'll just play matches. And that happens on the road. I don't play, I play in bunches, it seems. I'll go a month or two without playing, and then play 5 or 6 rounds or 15 rounds in a couple of days, and then not touch the clubs again for a while. So my game is very erratic, especially off the tee. But I try not to let that bother me too much. It's more just about the shots that come off the way you want, as opposed to the shots that don't. And there's a lot more of the latter than the former. But anytime you hit one the way you like, it feels pretty good. Can't wait to do it again.
Can you ever turn it off, the design part of your brain, where you're hitting a shot and you go, oh, that bunker's not placed right, or they should be like? Does it ever turn off, and you can just enjoy the course as it is, or you're always thinking about, even while playing, like how to improve, or what they should do better, or what you would do? It's
tough to turn it off. It is. The more you play a place, the more you can relax and just settle in and enjoy. And I find that happens more on the golf courses we build than seeing someplace new. Because, frankly, I don't get back to many golf courses often. I'll play something once, like most golfers, I guess. You play somewhere once, and then you really may not get back for a decade or two or ever. But, the courses we're building, especially if we're working on a renovation and we're doing 9 holes this year, 9 holes next year, you can kind of settle in and get to know a place a little more. And at some point, you've thought through all the thoughts you want to, that are bouncing around your head about architecture, and you can just settle in and play golf. And that, it takes, on the stuff we build, it usually takes a couple of years before you stop noticing all the little things that need to be touched up. Mm-hmm. But once you get to that point, it's a lot of fun. And I'm fortunate to have a few courses nearby home where I'm at that point now. I've played enough rounds where I've just gone out and playing golf and can have fun.
Which kind of leads me to this question, because I think one of the things you say the word renovation, and I think a lot of people get confused or they're not always sure of the difference between renovation and restoration. And I think everybody hears these words and they kind of like, all right, well, maybe I'm not really sure the difference. Can you walk us through the difference of those two to help distinguish that for our listeners?
Yeah, it's a pet peeve of mine. And frankly, there's little, people use those words interchangeably when they shouldn't, because the name Donald Ross or Tillinghast or Travis, they have brand value. So when a club is looking to tinker with their golf course, it's a lot easier to brand it a restoration to Donald Ross because that's got value. In spite of that, I would say 90+% of what's being done today is anything but restoration. It's renovation, but more often than not, the name restoration is chosen because it has that brand appeal. It takes a lot of work and a lot of diligence to truly restore a golf course. And, there are a few architects that do that very well. And I like to pride myself on my commitment to, when I'm working at a place like Hollywood or Montclair Golf Club, we're digging into the history as much as we can and finding all of the photographs, all of the information we can before we start. And then once we get into construction, we're really faithful to replicating as precisely as possible what was there 100 years ago, as opposed to, you hear so many architects say, well, we're doing what Donald Ross would have done if he were alive today. And, nobody knows what Donald Ross would have done today because the guy died 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and didn't leave instructions for what people should be doing with golf courses in 2025. So, there's certainly some interpretation and extrapolation done when people start talking that way. I don't work that way. I like to stick to exactly what was in the ground because, quite frankly, golf courses 100 years ago were built for the best players in the game. Golf was really hard 100 years ago. And most golf courses were laid out and designed for the best players in the game. And as a result, those golf courses still function really, really well for the average member today. And, you don't need to push all the bunkers out to 290 for the average player. So, if they're 230, 240, 250 off the tee, that works really well for most guys. And, quite frankly, that's the thing that gets changed the most is fairway bunkering. And the value and the importance of fairway bunkering is overrated in general. If you guys think about the last round you played, you might have found one or two or maybe three fairway bunkers, but people think about them as though they're this really important part of the strategy of the golf course, and they're just not. So
that's a really good point. Just didn't think like that.
Yeah, changing an original design for the sake of keeping it up to date for the modern game. The modern game is such too that the best players in the game hit it so far that if you put a fairway bunker where it's relevant for them and it's severe enough to matter, they'll lay up and still hit a 7 or an 8 iron into the green because you can't build par fours long enough to really challenge them anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's hard. I think it's a fool's errand to be pushing fairway bunkers down range. If you could push the tees back, that's, I'll make an exception. When you're restoring a golf course, if you could look to add length by pushing the tees back, that's a far preferable solution, I think. The extent to which you could preserve the original landing areas, because the way the golf course was routed, those original landing areas are important. They set up the sight lines into the greens. So the more that you can preserve the original landing areas by pushing the tees back, that's a good thing too.
What is that whole process like for you when you get to a place and you talk about like and I said this to you off air, but like, I love what you do as far as the history from what Mike and I have kind of seen, like you dive deep into the history. I was actually shocked to hear that you weren't like a history major, because it seems like you're one of these guys that is in like the dungeons of these places, trying to look at aerial photos, looking at old photos online, like what you gather and whatever you can get. And I love that. I love that you're trying to build the course to what it was and bring the history of it back. But what is that whole process like? Like how a place calls you and says, hey, I want you to do this. And you spend X amount of time looking at photos and then designing it and then bring it to them. Like, talk to us about how that all works.
Typically when a club reaches out, if it's a golf course I'm aware of and am interested in working in. I'll start that process, before I get hired, before I interview, just to sort out how much information is available. If it's a great old golf course where 6 of the greens have been changed and they moved the bunkers around and there's no old photos of what it was like 100 years ago, that makes restoration a lot tougher. And then it's less appealing to me. So if the goal is truly to restore a golf course, and I think, not every golf course deserves to be restored, but, the best examples of an architect's work, I think, are important to preserve in their original state. For nerds like me who, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I started studying golf courses, there were some pretty untouched examples of Ross's work, for instance. They aged, obviously, and greens have shrunken and bunkers have gotten a little ratty in places, but they hadn't been restored. Restoration wasn't a huge thing until Ron Pritchard, Bruce Hepner, and a handful of other folks really took to it years ago. But nowadays, every golf course in America feels like it's been restored at least once, if not multiple times, and there just aren't many original Donald Ross bunkers left. But I think it's important when doing restoration work, and to use that term strictly, to rebuild things as exactly as they were when the golf course was built, so that the next generation of people interested in architecture or want to study architecture, there are examples of that architect's work that are pretty pure to the way they built it. So in examples like that, where I feel a golf course deserves to be truly restored, there's a lot of research that goes into that, for me at least, prior to even taking the job. So finding out, do you have a bunch of old photos? Do you have an old aerial? Do you have any drawings or maps? And typically, the awareness that certain clubs have varies pretty considerably from one to the next. Some clubs have a really dedicated historian who's already done a bunch of that work for me. Other clubs have no idea what they have, and you're starting from scratch. Fortunately, I know a handful of people that are really into that sort of research and love digging into a place. And the internet has made it so much easier. Frankly, I can just go on Twitter and say, does anybody have little pictures of the 12th hole at Hollywood? There are guys that love doing that and have these libraries in their laptop and are happy to send them off. So the research has gotten a little bit easier over time. But that's an important part and a really fun part of researching what you're going to do. Because the more detailed information you have about what you're going to do, then there's less room for interpretation. And, if members don't like the way a bunker turned out, I can just point at the dead guy and blame him. If we've got a photo that verifies, that if I'm doing something, if I'm kind of put myself on a limb and people don't like it, then I've got to explain why I made that change. And so much of architecture is entirely subjective. So, me saying, well, I want this bunker to be 15 yards wide, and somebody else says, no, it should only be 7 yards wide. If you don't have an old photo to verify how wide that bunker should be, then my opinion is no more valid than yours, really. Right. Except I'm typically the one getting paid for my opinion. So
I would say you're the professional. We should listen to your opinion.
But that part of the process is really fun.
George Wall Ford in Red Bank, New Jersey is family owned and operated, proudly serving New Jersey residents with superior customer service since 1960. Rye, share your story about your experience there.
Mike, I went on a tangent in one of our episodes previously about it, but I can't say enough good things about George Wall Ford. I needed a new car. I had an old. I loved the brand that I had. I loved, it was an SUV, but had 165,000 miles on it. It was just time, So I hopped on over to George Wall Ford. I saw our guy Jerry, and Jerry and his team were awesome. I mean, from stem to stern, they're there, they're helping, they're knowledgeable. They have so many cars on the lot that you can go in and say, hey, I want a sunroof, a navigation. I want this kind of rims on it. I want this kind of this, that, and the other thing. There's a great chance that they have that car with all your specs, the color, all that thing. Me, I didn't particularly care. I just, I was like, hey, I want to be high up in the car, right? I need an SUV. I'm a big guy. I got a dog. I got golf clubs. I got beach chairs in the summer. I need something that's a little more rugged, a little more, again, I like to be higher in my car. And I went and saw Jerry. He pointed me in the right direction. And again, it's awesome to have that kind of help and support from your salesman to the finance guy to to even they got somebody who helps you set up your car, right? I got an app on my phone now that's got my auto start on it. I can locate my car if I don't know where it is. I could take a trip to Japan if I wanted to and be like, did I lock my car? And I can go into the app and lock my car. So even people helping you set up that stuff, just the hands-on approach over there is incredible. So if you need a car, head on over to George Wall. And go ask for Jerry. They were awesome there. Again, stem to stern from everybody. I can't say enough good things about it. It was an unbelievable experience.
So to Ryan's point, there isn't a better place to shop for a brand new car. Just call 732-704-1932 and ask for Jeremy Wall. George Wall Ford in Red Bank for all your car buying needs. And then when obviously, when you're talking restoration, Hollywood, I know you mentioned Montclair and you got North Jersey in the mix, especially when you're talking golfing in the Garden State here. But Hollywood is probably the big ticket. You're talking named golf courses, top 10 naturally in the Golf Digest's rankings. Like, what were some of the biggest discoveries or decisions you had to make when restoring, Hollywood?
We're fortunate the club hosted, let me get the year wrong, I think it was 1921. They hosted the U.S. Women's Amateur. And, it seems like if the USGA showed up at your property back in the day, there was a photographer with them. So we had a bunch of great photographs from that event. And the golf course was relatively new then. Travis had inherited a layout by a guy named Isaac Mackey, who did the routing. I'm going to forget the years. I think 1914 was when the Mackey course opened. And Travis was hired just a few more. 1917, I think he was hired, and his renovation opened in 1918. And in between there, one of the interesting things we learned was that they paid Seth Rayner like $5,000 to do something. And I think it was $5,000. And that's not an insignificant amount of money in 1916. But we couldn't find any record of exactly what he did, but they paid him to do something. And hired Travis a year later. And Travis retained a lot of Mackey's routing, but redid all the greens, all the bunkers, changed the details, and changed a couple holes around. One of the most interesting things we found, in addition to the pictures, was Travis was hired by a green chairman named Frank Barrett, who remained the green chairman, I think, in the late 30s, if I remember right. Barrett was very involved in working with Travis, and to the point of almost considering himself or being considered kind of a co-designer in the project. And Hollywood's really different from anything else Travis ever did. And I don't know if that's Frank Barrett's influence or the fact that Travis was working with Crump at Pine Valley at the time. Because it's a sandy place, there are a lot of bunkers, it has some kind of visual similarities to Pine Valley. But in any case, when the golf course reopened after the renovation, Frank Barrett wrote a little booklet for the members, like, here's the golf course is reopening, here's how to quickly acquaint yourself with the golf course. So he wrote, like a paragraph or two about each hole, what had been changed, what they did, and now what to expect and how to play it. That was really helpful because that gave us some insight. Things had changed over the years at Hollywood. The bunkers had been redone. They've changed a few greens. That was really helpful to understand Barrett's perspective on what had been built and gave us some insight into what we needed to undo and redo.
And if he was working so closely with Travis that he's got intimate knowledge, and yes, to be able to put that, I wonder, like, do they still have that? Is that something that you could, like, you physically held that, or it was like
I had a digital copy of it. I don't know where that came from. I think the club does have a paper copy of that. I don't recall ever holding it myself, but I think they do have a paper copy of it. The bit I got was digital.
As I said, nerdy history guy, just nerding out over like.
Yeah, it's fun to hold those things in your hand. Mm-hmm. I worked at Pine Valley years ago for the superintendent. I just worked maintenance there for 6 or 7 months, and they gave me a day in the archives, which is impressive, massive. And one of the things I got to hold was Harry Colt's little booklet where he drew every hole. They let me take photocopies of it. It was crazy to be able to hold that thing. Was really neat.
Very cool.
The other things that they let me look through, which is cool.
Wow. Yeah, and then Obviously, last week on the podcast, we had Brian Pfeiffer on, to Ryan's earlier point, at North Jersey, and it just seems like, but better timing to get you on as well, because, you helped in that as, kind of restoring, right? That's the right word. I want to make sure I say that.
That one I struggle with. The goal was to restore something that felt like Travis.
Gotcha.
North Jersey is an example of a place where we didn't have many old photographs. So, and unfortunately, they had changed a bunch of greens over the years. And, they thankfully still have seven original greens that were intact, but they changed 11 of them. And, a message to all the green chairmen and presidents out there that are listening: once you change an original green, it's really hard to get it back. These days you can scan a green with, pretty impressive precision and have a map of it. And, that you can recreate. If you've got that, you can recreate it pretty authentically. Nobody was doing that 20, 30 years ago when they were blowing up the greens at North Jersey. So we don't have any of those records, or 50, 70 years ago. We had a few kind of vague photographs of some of the greens. The 18th, we had a pretty good photograph of, which is, on a set of wild greens. That might be the wildest one out there, but we had something to work off of there. And, similar to Hollywood, the thing we had, when shortly after the golf course opened, the club had I think it was a monthly magazine they put out to the members. And there were 9 consecutive installments of that magazine where the pro at the time, I think his name was Johnny Golden, which is a cool name for a golf pro. He wrote same thing, like 2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs about each hole. Each month was a pair of holes. And, a lot of it was, I like to hit a long draw off the tee here, so I've got a little fade into the green, how he would play the golf hole. But it would mention, the 15th, like, this is a hard shot because the back portion of the green is lower than the front. So, we didn't have any photographs of the 15th hole, but that was something we could start with.
Yeah.
So, I don't really consider North Jersey a true restoration because we didn't have enough information to go back and say we could put this back precisely. We had some aerial photographs, which were helpful. We had Johnny Golden's descriptions and a handful of photos. So we put it back as best as we could with the information we have. But to say, it's not, I wouldn't say it's 100% accurate, but it was based on the information we had. My best guess at what used to be there. And, I spent a lot of time studying Travis's work and trying to build greens that reflect something he would have built. But again, once you blow up an original green, if you don't have great documentation, putting it back is nearly impossible. But we did the best we could, and I'm really, really happy with the results. And, the pros there, Brian Pfeiffer and Brian Mackey, great players. Both of those guys could play. And they were really helpful. I think when I got there, the golf course had 68 bunkers, something like that. And Travis didn't build many bunkers there. It's a really rocky place. So he built some mounds and play, some in the middle of the fairway, but he didn't build many bunkers because that would have been a lot of work. So we've pared back the number of bunkers, and I think we're down to about 20. And, the first, the knee-jerk reaction by most members is you're taking up 45, 50 bunkers. This is going to be way too easy. And in the place of those bunkers, we had a bunch of short grass, and, having both Brians around to say, whoa, this golf course is way harder than it used to be for us. And I don't think it is for the average members. I don't think it got a lot harder, but for good players, the short grass around the greens instead of the bunkers makes it a lot tougher because, those greenside bunkers, if you miss a green, the greenside bunkers are going to grab you and keep you close to the green.
Yeah.
And North Jersey is a hilly site. And if you miss the first green to the left and there's no bunker there to catch you, you're 12 feet below the green. You can't see where you're going to a green. It's got a lot of movement. So the recovery is a lot tougher.
Been there, done that.
We've experienced that, Brian. We've experienced that firsthand.
Missed left. Ain't right.
It's such an interesting. So I we joke on the podcast because we've been fortunate to go up to North Jersey a few times and get to play with Brian Mackey and meet Brian Pfeiffer and have him out, on the podcast last week and hearing. I love it there. I think what you did there is absolutely magical. And I think that kind of, as we've talked through with you in between, like going to Hollywood and some of the other places, you've kind of gotten this, like, that you're the Walter Travis whisperer. for lack of a better term, right? Is there something about Travis that kind of like molds to your eye, or like why is it that you have more Travis courses, or is that just, am I making that up?
I'm a huge fan of his work. I don't,
Okay.
I don't like being called the Travis Whisperer or a Travis expert. You hear that a lot in architecture. We hired this Ross expert to redo our golf course, and it certainly helps to be well acquainted with an architect's body of work, particularly what that architect was doing at that time in their career. Like Donald Ross worked for 40 years. And what he was doing in the teens is totally different than what he was doing in the late 20s and 30s. So it helps to have an awareness of what he was doing at the time, what his style was like. But you don't need to be a Travis expert necessarily to restore Hollywood. You need to be a Hollywood expert and just commit to understanding exactly what he did in Hollywood. And in the case of Hollywood, that was totally different than the style of golf he built in North Jersey or Aquanic or anywhere else he worked. So it's important to be an expert of that particular golf course and not import stereotypical Travis features or Ross features. You've got to dial in, what he did on that particular site. So that's more important in restoring. So I don't want to be called a Travis expert, but I'm a huge fan of his work. In 2 weeks, I'm going to Quebec to see a place called Grand Mare, which is a golf course. He did 9 holes. C.H. Allison did the other 9. That's the last Travis course in the world that I haven't seen. And I'm just a huge fan of his work. I've always enjoyed building greens. That's one of my favorite things to do. And studying his greens, I think Travis built more interesting greens than any architect that ever lived. So I'm not pursuing his list just to tick off all the Travis courses, but every one of his golf courses I see has a couple of greens or a bunch of greens that I would love to replicate someday and steal ideas from. So I've made an effort to try and see all of his golf courses just because I want to study the greens he built. So
yeah. They're diabolical. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're not huge. I mean, they have a lot of contour and they can be pretty severe, and they're not 12,000 square feet. They're typically 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 square feet, some even smaller that have a lot of contour in them. They still work really well at today's green speeds. I mean, they're a challenge, but he contoured them in a way where you're not putting off greens and rolling 20 feet down the approach or 20 yards down the approach. Typically, you can keep it on the green, and if you're creative, you've got a chance to get it close. And even at today's green speeds, which are twice as fast as they were when he built them, his greens still work really well, which you can't say for a lot of old architects. So
has that been really hard to do because the equipment of the game and because the speed of the greens? Has that been something that you've had to adjust as you've become looking at his courses and looking at the design? Like, how difficult has that been to kind of keep up to date with things like green speed?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of softening greens. It's something I don't want to get into. If a club has an original green by Travis or Tillinghast or Ross, I don't want to change it. The goal then becomes persuading the club that running all their greens at 13 is stupid. And I've got a client in New Jersey who has a brilliant set and a very severe set of Donald Ross greens. They insist on keeping them way too fast, so they're losing out a bunch of the hole locations. And a few years ago, they tried to soften a few. It didn't work out very well. And I tried to put those greens back the way they used to be, and they're really severe, but they've got a brilliant set of greens. And they're ruining them by insisting that they keep them too fast on a daily basis. And especially for tournaments, they just don't have many hole locations. And I don't, that's something I don't really understand, but I do understand. I think it's all driven by ego, both by the membership and golf course superintendents. I have a lot of respect for superintendents. What they do is remarkable. And what they're able to do these days, they can get greens as fast as you want. It doesn't mean you should. And, if you've got a great set of original Ross greens and the club down the street, has dead flat greens built by somebody in the 60s, they're going to get their greens faster. They need to. The neighbor doesn't have a great set of greens, so they have to be fast to be interesting. So don't dumb your greens down just to keep up with that place that has bad greens. You got great greens. They should be envious of you and run your greens at a speed that makes sense for you. And I've gotten to the point, and I don't necessarily think every green in the golf course needs to be the same speed. And you can't set up 18 greens mowers and make them all the perfect speed for that individual green. But if there are 2 or 3 greens that keep you from getting the rest of them fast, maybe you can mow those a little differently and don't tell anybody, because if they're severe and steep, they're going to play fast. And I tell this story about Augusta National. I worked there in 1999 and 2000, and there are 3 greens there were at the time. They've probably been softened since a couple of times, but there were a couple of greens there where parts of the greens are pretty severe. You've got these big contours, and as we mowed those greens, you would lift up the greens mower and just not mow that part of the green every day. So there were parts of the greens at Augusta National, even during the Masters, that hadn't been mowed in 3 days. And the rest of the greens were mowed every day, or several times every day. But parts of those greens did not get mown every day. They got mown a couple times a week and a little bit higher. Nobody would have noticed. And I've told superintendents that, it's like, oh, you should just, not mow that part of the green as fast. Yeah. And like, what are you talking about? Crazy? It's like, well, we did it at Augusta. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait, you did what? And, if Augusta can do it, you can do it.
Yeah.
So it's about managing the greens you have to the speed you want. And I don't want to get into the game of softening greens, because once you soften the most severe green on the golf course, 3 years later, there's another one that's the most severe green, and they're going to change that. And if you commit to that cycle over the course of 100 years, you end up with dull greens. And I don't want to be a part of that.
And isn't that something that everybody hears? Like, everybody wants to go putt on greens that are running. Oh, they're running at a 13. Like, they're firm and fast. And that's what everybody like kind of hears. And that's kind of like the buzzword that everyone wants to play. But it seems like this particular course is leaning into that buzzword as opposed to doing maybe what's best for them.
Yeah. And I'm a huge fan of firm. And I think firm should be the goal, and speed can be a byproduct of firm. But, especially on greens, that first bounce is the thing that makes golf tough for good players. If a green's soft and you can throw darts, like they're playing in Texas this week, Scheffler is 23 under through 3 days. If you've got soft greens, there's very little you can do to challenge the best players in the world. I think firm greens and wind are the most important elements, and greens don't have to be particularly fast to test Scotty Scheffler. He's good with that. But if they're firm, that tests his approach shot, that tests putting, that tests recovery play. So I think firm greens should be the goal, and speed is far less important.
So firm is not necessarily fast.
Exactly. Yeah. I think if speed can be a byproduct, but speed is not the thing that challenges good players. It makes things a nightmare for the 16 handicap. Mm-hmm. But for a scratch player or a plus player, fast greens are right up their alley, especially if they've been softened and there's less contour to them and less slope.
Yeah.
That becomes easy.
Well, I think it's like you said in the Golf Digest article a few years ago, like, it says firm and smooth is the best way to go. And I think to your point, like that nails it on the head, because, the smooth aspect is, I think, something that gets, forgotten about too, because everybody focuses so much is on the stip meter. What's your stimp? What are you rolling at? But if the putt is not rolling over end and it's bouncing a few times, it doesn't matter if you're 13, if you're 9, like the smooth thing, I think, is something that truly gets forgotten about.
Yes. Yep, I agree. And the modern grasses and modern equipment, the grasses like being mown short. These modern bent grass varieties, POA in the Northeast, you can get them fast. It doesn't take a whole lot of work anymore. So you've almost got to dial things back intentionally to keep them at a reasonable speed at clubs that have severe greens.
Yeah. I think the other thing I want to bring up here is I mentioned to a couple of people that we were having you on, and they said, listen, you got to do us a solid and ask them about the Lido. And I know, where it originated is a little outside our boundaries there in Long Island, but I think the story of that to you guys taking it over to, moving it more or less identically to Wisconsin is something that is an unbelievable thing, because this golf course prior to World War II was like the spot. Tell us that story. What made you take that rendering and move it basically west and more or less replicate it to almost like, from what people have said, it's a damn near perfect image of what it was.
I think so. It was a fascinating project, and I was really fortunate to be a part of it. As you mentioned, Lido in the 19-teens, 20s. Most educated folks that had traveled around it thought it was one of the 2 or 3 or 4 best golf courses in the world. Bernard Darwin himself said that he thought it was the best golf course in the world, which is a pretty good endorsement. It was built by C.B. McDonald, 115 acres, I think. There's an interesting story in McDonald's book about how he was approached to design the Lido. Basically, it was a kind of a who's who. A bunch of heavy hitters decided they wanted to build a golf course on Long Island and found this 115-acre site that was half swampland and told McDonald, it's like, yeah, we've got this tiny site that's half underwater. We'd love you to build a golf course there. Are you interested? And by that point, McDonald had retired from designing golf courses. And not surprisingly, that didn't really appeal to him. But then they said, well, we'll give you all the money in the world and you can do whatever you want. And McDonald had a pretty big ego, and that's all he needed to hear. So he was in, and it took a couple of years, and they dredged a million yards of sand out of the channel and pumped it into the site to essentially create whatever he wanted to create, including 25, 30-foot hills. So as much as the National was McDonald's version of the ideal golf course, the holes of the National were found golf holes. There was a fair bit of construction there in building the greens, but the topography is really what makes a lot of the great holes at National what they are. And at Lido, he could create from scratch. And that's always a fascinating thing to study when a golf architect has a dead flat site and they're just creating. That to me, that's the best expression of what an architect believes is important about golf architecture. And that was McDonald's best example. He was starting from scratch and could create whatever he wanted. The only limitation really was the size of the site, which 115 acres is not big. But the solutions he came up with are pretty clever. So, Lido was always highly regarded, but never did well as a club. It was built pretty quickly with a lot of fill, so it struggled with drainage throughout its lifetime. Wasn't always in great shape, and it was kind of hard to get to at the time. So for a variety of reasons, it struggled financially through most of its existence. And by the time World War II came around, the Navy took it and bulldozed more than half the holes. And there wasn't much left after the war. Somebody purchased it and thought about putting it back together, decided that was too much work. So right next door to Lido, today is another place called the Lido Golf Club, which was built by Robert Trent Jones in the late 40s or 50s, I think. Contrary to what some people believe, there's nothing left of the original Lido on that golf course. It's a completely different property. They tried to kind of replicate one of the holes, the famous channel hole. It's a very different version of that hole that doesn't really reflect the original. But the original Lido golf course is long gone. It's buried under a neighborhood. There's a high school out there, an elementary school, parks, and all that. But the quality of the golf course has intrigued developers over the years to really dream about restoring it. And one of those people was Mike Kaiser and his sons, Michael and Chris, who developed Barnbougle Dunes, Sand Valley, among other places. They've been fascinated with the idea of rebuilding Lido. They've talked about that at Barnbougle Dunes, the golf course that became Old McDonald, which we built 15 years ago, 20 years ago. The Kaisers are throwing around the idea of that site being the Lido, but it really wasn't well adapted to recreating the golf course. It was talked about at Streamsong, to build Lido with Streamsong. And Tom Doak was always part of those conversations with Mr. Kaiser. And, Tom kind of held the line. He said, if we can't recreate it authentically and accurately, I'm not going to do something that, is kind of like the Lido when we throw that name on and pretend it's real. If we can't do it accurately, then it's not worth doing. And, a variety of circumstances, including a bunch of technology, got us to the point where Tom felt comfortable, along with the Kaisers, that, we think we can actually do this in a way that truly honors the original design and will be the original golf course to the extent that we can. And I was fortunate to be involved in that. And we talked earlier about the amount of research that goes into restoring a golf course. And, a place like Hollywood, that's a lot of work. How big are the greens, the bunker, the specifics of the bunkers. And GPS has allowed us to restore those things really accurately. And at Lido, we did the same thing, trying to, look, we had some great old aerial photographs, a bunch of ground level photos, a bunch of articles talking about the golf course. And a fellow named Peter Flory out of Chicago had created a virtual model of the golf course to play as a video game. And in doing so, Peter dug up an extraordinary amount of information about the golf course that was the basis of helping us really understand what the golf course should be. But at Lido, it wasn't just tweaking bunkers to get back to the original, or tweaking the green shapes, or pushing fairway lines out. I mean, we were recreating in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, not just the greens, bunkers, and tees, but every fairway contour as best we could. So, the site at Lido is a little bigger. It's about 140 or 150 acres, I think the golf course takes up. But there's very little of that site that was just shaped haphazardly. I mean, almost every square inch of that site we were trying to get right, which is an extraordinary amount of work, both mentally and physically. But again, we had the resources so that we could, trace the fairway contours and feel like we could put them back pretty precisely. We just had a lot of information to go from. So I think the end result is a very authentic and very accurate recreation of what McDonald Rainer had built in New York 100 years ago.
It's so cool. It's so cool that it's such a cool story, and the history that's got there, and some guy creates it in a video game because he's got it. It's got all the things to make the aura so big about it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story.
Yeah,
and that part intrigued me from the beginning. I was excited to be a part of it because people had talked about it forever, and I knew the history. It's like, this is going to be really cool. But I'd worked for Tom Doak for 20 years, and the mantra was always, just find a great site, find great routing on that site, and then build some cool greens. And that's a great golf course. That's how you build great golf. It wasn't find a dead flat site and move a million yards of dirt around and create something really cool. That's just not the way we worked. So I was a little skeptical about how good the golf course, A, ever was, and B, how good it could be, until we got into construction. And the level of detail and thought that McDonald put into that golf course is, surpasses anything any other architect, living or dead, would have done. I think he was the perfect guy for that project. And the golf course, part of it is built on pure sand, and it's fescue. The greens are bent, but everything else is fescue. So it's also a windy site, and it plays like a links. And I'm fortunate to have played there a fair bit at this point. It's become one of my very favorite golf courses in the world to play, to the point where I think it's a top 20 golf course. So my original skepticism about how good the golf course could be is long come and gone.
Long gone.
It's a great golf course, in addition to being a great story.
Yeah, understatement. I knew that was something that a lot of people had mentioned to me, so I was like, listen, I had heard this story, maybe a couple months ago about how the video gamers came about. You guys got involved, and I said, okay, this is definitely something we're going to bring up. But like, as you kind of look to the future, what are some things, if you're even allowed to share, that you're excited about potentially working on, or that you are working on? Are there any things you're able to share about what the future holds for you in terms of, restoring golf courses?
Yeah, I've got a handful of new clients. I'm trying to slow down that part of my business a little bit, because there are some new build opportunities that have come up, both for our company and myself personally, that will take some of my time. So I'm scaling back how many consulting clubs I work with these days. Though I've just been hired not too long ago by Country Club of Scranton, which is a phenomenal Walter Travis golf course. So we're just starting to talk about what to do there, and hopefully we can chip away at that. And over time, put back a lot of what's been lost there. Aquanic is another golf course up in Vermont where I work now. That was Travis's first foray into golf architecture. That'll be exciting to work with them. So I've got a few newish consulting clients. I work with St. George's Hill in London as well, and that'll be a really exciting restoration of Harry Colt's work there that will take a really phenomenal golf course and make it even better. So I've got a handful of wonderful consulting clients, and I'm certainly not naming all of them, and I'm missing some, and I hope they're not offended. But yeah, I'm lucky to have a handful of great consulting clients where I'll be working in the next couple of years. And a few new build opportunities as well, hopefully.
When you take on a client, are they a client for life, or are they a client until like the job's done, and then it's like, okay, if they like going back to Hollywood, like if they call you and be like, hey, can you come? We got to look at this, or this is something. Is it client for life, or consultant for life, or is it like once the job's done, we're moving on?
My goal is to have a long relationship, and I make that really clear from the beginning that you're not just hiring me to redo your bunkers. You're hiring me to be a consulting architect for as long as we can both have each other.
Yeah.
I was just back in Hollywood a couple months ago to redo a couple tee boxes. I'm thrilled that they called as opposed to just doing that in-house or hiring somebody else. I try to make sure that I've always got time for my clients, and that it is a long-term relationship. And anytime work happens on the golf course, please reach out, and let's talk through this together to make sure that if we're going to do some work, we're only doing it once, and we're going to make sure we're doing it right. So I'm fortunate to have great relationships with my consulting clients, with the superintendents of those clubs.
Yeah.
I hope those are long relationships.
Nice. Yeah, that's I like that. Well, those tee boxes at Hollywood just opened the other day, so.
Yep. Yeah, I think they're a big improvement.
Yeah.
There's a few more to go, but yeah, we're chipping away at stuff there. It's such a great place, one of my favorites.
But listen, Brian, I probably could continue just grilling you with questions about this or that in terms of architecture and restoring golf courses. I know we didn't even bring up Old Barnwell, and I know that's another, spot that you've worked on or working on at the time. But I appreciate you coming on here, giving us, some of your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you, fellas. I enjoyed the chat. I like talking about golf in New Jersey. It's a very underrated golf state. A lot of great players up there, a lot of great golf courses. Yeah, it gets a bad rap sometimes, Jersey does, but it's a really diverse state with a lot of great golf.
We think so
too. Gotta have thick skin up here, buddy. You know that.
Yeah, Brian, this has been awesome. It's really been cool, like picking your brain and see it. And as we've kind of dug into this, the golf course, the architecture is not something I ever thought I'd be interested in. The more that Mike and I do, the more that we talk to people, the more that we, hear about what golf courses are doing and the work they're doing. It's super, super interesting to me. And I think a growing number of our the people that listen. So thank you for jumping on. This has really been both educational and super cool to nerd out on.
Appreciate it. Enjoy the conversation.
Yeah. Take care.
All right, guys. Bye-bye.